Welcome. Thank you for joining us in another edition of Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, and I serve as the host of our program. I'm a professor of sociology at Western Michigan University. Joining me are my two viewmeisters, as we're used to be called. On my left is Don Cooney. Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western Michigan University, and he also serves as the vice mayor of Kalamazoo. Very busy in that job these days. And also on my right is Denise Keel. Denise is a professor in the Department of Political Science and the Institute for the Environment and Sustainability. Did I nail it? Oh, it's of? I thought it was for. One of these days I'll get it right. Used to be called Environmental Studies.
Right.
We have a new name, a new institute.
Yes.
Very important work.
Great.
And additionally, Denise has another hat that she wears as the chair of the WMU Working Group on Climate Change.
That's right.
And so we're keeping her very busy also.
Yes.
So, well, thank you for joining us. The critical issue that we're going to start with today is the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize. And it didn't get a lot of publicity this time around, and that's a shame because the Nobel Peace Prize for 2017 was awarded to a group called the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. I like their acronym,
Yeah.
I can.
Ah.
I can. And the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Now, this group was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize because of their work was very instrumental in getting the United Nations to pass a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Now, most people in the United States have no idea that this treaty passed. It passed last July, and there's a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. Well, how come we didn't hear about that? Well, our media didn't cover it. Our government didn't participate in the process. In fact, none of the nuclear weapon states participated at all.
Wow.
There are
No
9
kidding.
nuclear weapon states. Not a one of them participated. They basically said, you guys go over there, go ahead and create your treaty. We're going to stay over here and keep our weapons.
Wow.
Thank you very much. But if 50 nations ratify the treaty, it will go into effect. Now, of course, it doesn't have much practical effect at this point since the nuclear weapon states refuse to even participate in the negotiation process. They're not going to follow the treaty. But there is the hope that this can continue to create an international legal norm that says that you are not allowed to have nuclear weapons, that if you possess nuclear weapons, you need to get rid of them, that this is not right, this is not legal, this is not moral, and to kind of create a pressure, a moral and political pressure on the nuclear weapon states to begin to move toward getting rid of the weapons. And, creating those kind of international legal norms can be important. They don't have the same practical effect, but they can be important.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that,
Absolutely.
Miss Political Scientist?
I really appreciated the approach that they took in their campaigns. We have a nuclear proliferation treaty from the 60s, disarmament. Of course, all of us actually lived through the main deterrent of mutually assured destruction, right? Not the best deterrent to not use nuclear weapons. Instead of taking those sort of militaristic or protection stances, this group really went at it with a humanitarian approach, from what I understand, and saying the most vulnerable folks who do not have these weapons are the most at risk. And that is not okay. And so instead they've made it this moral humanitarian issue rather than about defense and military and stockpiling and those kinds of deterrents. And I think that was very telling. Again, the countries that didn't sign it, right? So every country in Africa, I think, has signed it, except for maybe one, right? All of South America, right? All of the small island states, right? So all of these countries are saying, yeah, rest of the world, wake up. We've got all sorts of other issues that we could be dealing with, and yet we're still worried about this threat from the rest of you of things like nuclear bombs and climate change. Very similar commons type of problem. Who's going to be affected by this? Yet who is the one causing the actual problem? And this group took that same moral humanitarian approach, and I think that's why they got the support that they did. It was a different way to frame the issue.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to say, I'm so glad that that issue is on the table now,
Yeah.
because the discussion has been about how do we expand and the president's threats, we can completely destroy. We'll wipe you out. So, and then that is sort of taken as the common sense of the times that we have these. We can use them when we need them. Yeah. Now the whole question of the possession of them is on the table, and I think that's great.
That's right.
Yeah. There's some legal precedents that we might want to just point to. At one point, the World Court, the International Court of Justice, was asked for an advisory opinion about whether it would ever be legal to use nuclear weapons. And they basically said no.
Wow.
They punted a little bit.
Yes.
Wow.
They punted a little bit, but they said under most circumstances, except for extreme survival of the nation,
Right.
any use or threat to use of nuclear weapons will be illegal under international law. And they didn't create any new law.
That's right.
They simply went back and looked at international humanitarian law, the laws of war, and they said, look, any threat or use of nuclear weapons would not be consistent with that body of law, which goes back to the 19th century.
That's right.
And that any threat to use or threat or actual use of nuclear weapons would violate that body of law, therefore will be illegal under international law.
Yeah.
So you have that precedent, and that was 1998 when they made that advisory opinion. Now we also, you mentioned the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I think that's a very important treaty
Right.
to go back to as
Right.
well. That was first created in 1968,
That's right.
and the United States signed it. And it was kind of a bargain between the nuclear weapon states at the time and the rest of the world. I mean, basically said, look, we don't want nuclear weapons to spread. We don't want any proliferation. This is the Non-Proliferation
That's right.
Treaty.
Right.
They said, so let's make a deal. If you guys, the rest of the world, if you don't develop nuclear weapons,
That's right.
okay, you don't try to do that so that we don't have a spread of these weapons, then we'll get rid of ours.
Right.
That was the deal.
Right.
That was the bargain. We agreed, we have a
Yeah.
legal obligation to disarm. And yet, of course, we haven't done that. So the nuclear weapon states have completely violated their solemn legal obligation under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to move toward disarmament. They refused to do it. And so, you know, now, of course, we have other states that are, well, of course, the states that developed nuclear weapons after that point never signed the Non-Proliferation
That's
Treaty.
right.
Israel, who
Right.
still won't to this day admit that they have nuclear weapons.
Right.
India, Pakistan,
mhm.
and now, of course, we
North Korea.
have North
Korea.
Korea, who
North
did
Korea.
originally sign it, but basically said, well, if you're not going to follow, see, this is
how
so
it works.
important. If you guys aren't going to follow your end of the deal, then
right.
why should we stay in the
Right.
treaty, especially when you're threatening us?
That's right.
So we're going to withdraw, and so this is the whole basis for the North Korean stalemate, I think.
Right.
They
Yeah.
withdrew, they started to develop nuclear weapons, and that leads us to the current kind of back and forth between Trump and Kim Jong-un.
Right. And which is why in this current treaty you see all the countries that don't have nuclear weapons starting to stand up and say, hey guys, remember this,
Right,
this proliferation?
Yeah.
Remember our deal? And now we're at an even bigger threat. And there was some language in the original deal that said, well, we'll give you some time to phase down and get rid of these things, right?
Right.
And we have reduced the number of overall
Yeah.
weapons, but haven't gotten rid of them. But you know, giving someone due time to do something, how many years is that?
68. Wow.
68
It's like
to-
all deliberate speed. in
Yeah.
the
It reminds me of Brown v.
Yeah.
Board of Education, the Civil Rights Movement,
Yeah.
right?
Do
We'll give you some
deliberate
time to figure
speed.
that out, but
Yeah.
not this long, right?
Yeah.
And so that's another reason I think why ICANN really started this movement. You know, here's everyone else on the
wonderful.
other side of this issue. What have you guys been doing, right? It really puts them out. But the treaty and the International Court of Justice is interesting. You know, after a nuclear war, you don't really, have time to go to court.
Right.
Right.
So it's one of these really interesting issues of mootness, and that's why they came out, I think, with a little bit stronger decision than they've ever been known to make. They're a bit of a paper tiger. Folks can bring their claims to them, and they give recommendations usually. And this
Right.
was one of their stronger statements
Yeah.
because of this idea of once this happens, we can't remedy.
Yeah,
We can't,
right.
redress the wrongs that have been done from nuclear war. But their normal operating procedure is to say, countries, go make a treaty that we can support. And so again, this group is doing sort of exactly what we would expect
Yeah.
in international law
Yeah.
and following the right steps. So I'm glad to see they got the recognition for all of those reasons and making this effort.
And the World Court also, at the time in 1998, basically went back and pointed to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and
right.
said, look, you guys, you signed this
You
agreement.
have a treaty.
And in a unanimous portion of the advisory opinion, they said, you guys need to step up and
Right.
do what you pledged to do back in
That's right, yeah.
1968.
Yeah.
And of course, they haven't.
Yeah, and when you look at what's going on now in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the number of civilian deaths that are there that are now more or less accepted. This is, well, collateral damage. We don't really mean to do this. This is going to happen.
That's right.
But that's the thing about nuclear weapons is that it's total destruction, and it doesn't matter. It's not military against military. It's just all those innocent people. Remember, we brought that woman here who was a survivor of the of Hiroshima,
Yeah.
and she spoke about the terrible things that she had witnessed and all the operations she had gone through. I think people tend to forget, and they tend to take it, well, this is just a cost that we have to follow through. No, it's immoral. It's just
Right.
immoral.
Some harms are unacceptable
Right.
to put on humanity, right? And their argument is that this is one of them. Yeah.
Right. I go back to the Second World War, when the Nazis first bombed areas. What was the famous painting? I think it was Litici.
Picasso's.
Yeah, Picasso's painting.
Guernica.
Yes.
Guernica. People were,
That's right.
the outrage that this innocent town that wasn't a military was bombed. And where are we today? We just sort of brush it off, and we talk as if, okay, we can drop this bomb on North Korea and that'll settle that.
Right.
But
Yeah,
the
yeah.
morality of the whole thing, the respect for human life,
Right.
totally off the table.
And now we've entered into a situation where it's never been more critical to point to this issue and to bring it back to public consciousness, because we've got a lot of things that have been happening. Now, let me just point out one thing that a lot of people don't probably know about, and that is Russia has been accused of violating the intermediate range nuclear treaty with the development of a cruise missile. So now we're allocating $650 or $65 million to develop our own new cruise missile,
Oh, boy.
which would also violate the treaty.
Right.
So here we have one treaty that has been concluded between Russia, the Russian Federation, and the United States that both sides seem to be playing footsie with, and could lead to a violation. So that's not good. But of course, we know that the big issue has been North Korea,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
then now also, President Trump wants to decertify the agreement with Iran. Okay, we concluded an agreement with Iran a couple of years ago that they would turn over most of their weapons-grade material. They wouldn't seek to develop a weapon. And for some reason, Trump is just outraged by this treaty, which is, it's just hard to understand. I mean, most of what Trump thinks is hard to understand from my
Wow.
perspective. But why would you crack down on a treaty that has prevented Iran from pursuing and getting a nuclear weapon? If he decertifies the treaty, which I guess he's not going to do now, there are going to be
It
some
sounds like there's some take back of that.
some face-saving
Wow.
mechanism is going to emerge, apparently, and he's going to punt it to Congress to come up with some criteria to determine whether they're in violation
Yeah.
or not. But why would you threaten to withdraw from a treaty? If he does that, then what's Iran going to do?
Oh, yeah.
Of course, they're going to go, if
Yeah.
the treaty's no longer valid, it opens up a path for them to go ahead and develop nuclear
That's
weapons
right.
anyhow. So now,
But
Yeah.
there's other nations involved in
That's
that
just
treaty.
where I was going to go. Yes. Well, so one of the main reasons that that treaty is so important is that, and this is where Trump just does not understand geopolitics, right?
No.
Many other nations were depending on the U.S.'s strength to make that treaty. Saudi Arabia is a prime example. Saudi Arabia has essentially said, which they've signed this now, but they've essentially said, as long as Iran doesn't have weapons, we're okay. But they have supposedly a side deal with Pakistan to pay them for the technology and go ahead and create weapons if Iran is ever allowed to continue with their program. So the U.S. is able to use its hegemony, right, its strength and power in the world to create this deal with Iran, and that's keeping, we know for sure, Saudi Arabia, but probably plenty of other
Yeah.
countries in that region who are enemies with Iran from also wanting to get nuclear weapons in the age-old defense of defending themselves, right? And it's like he doesn't get that.
Right.
You know, it's not just us that
Yeah.
are losing in this treaty. We're
Yeah.
gaining world peace through
Yeah.
that treaty.
Yeah.
And we have European partners.
That's
Russia
right.
and China are also part
Exactly
of
right.
the what's called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is
That's
what
right.
it's called. So we have lots of other other nations that support it.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely no evidence that Iran has violated the
That's right.
No.
treaty, the
That's
agreement.
No, everybody
The,
says
the
no.
International Atomic Energy Agency has found no violations. And
Right.
there are inspections, and
Right.
no other nation claims that Iran is in any way
That's right.
violating the treaty. I listened to some Republican congressman on NPR this morning, and he
Yeah.
was claiming there were all kinds of material violations. And that's just completely
Not true.
false. There are no material violations that have been uncovered by any of the agencies that are doing the inspection,
Yeah.
or have some stake in this whole
Yeah.
process.
And even some of Trump's closest advisors,
Yes.
or whatever they're called, minders, whatever. Anyhow, they're saying no.
Workers
They're
in the
saying-
adult daycare center?
Right, yeah.
I think the main objection from Trump, at least when he was on the campaign trail, was that the United States had given money as part of the making that deal, right? And
Their money.
Yeah, exactly.
Their money that they had stored here,
exactly.
yeah.
And, you know, however much it was, I think it's worth it.
Exactly.
Would be the counter argument,
Didn't cost
right?
us any
I
money.
mean, it didn't really cost us anything.
No.
No,
That
it wasn't that the United States was giving Iran
No.
money. It was that we were unfreezing
That's right.
Iranian
Yes.
assets
Yes.
that had been
It was
frozen
their
at
assets.
an earlier
Exactly
point.
right.
It's their money. We
Their
just
money.
froze their access
We
to
just
it.
allowed them to use it, and I think that's a pretty good deal for
Yeah.
not making
Exactly.
nuclear weapons, right?
And especially at this point in Iran's political situation, because now a more moderate faction has come to power
That's right.
in Iran. And so if Trump would do this, if he would decertify and back out of the deal, renege on the deal, then what's that do to the moderates in Iran? It undercuts them politically. That means the hardliners come back into play. So now we're
That's right.
Much more dangerous
in a much
situation
more
for everybody.
dangerous
That's right.
Yeah.
situation.
No,
Which is
terrible.
the parallel to North Korea, right? The whole sort of political argument is that you need that enemy in order to continue to get your support, especially for the North Korean as a dictatorship, right? The more you can point to the
Right.
U.S. as an enemy, the stronger you keep that dictatorship, or the more you put extremists into power. And I think they're both using each other.
And that's
right?
exactly what's happened in North Korea,
Yeah,
right?
right.
I mean, they're saying, just like we told you, these guys are out to destroy us, and now we have to defend it. We have to keep these things.
That's
yeah.
right. Well, it keeps the whole military complex going, right?
Right, there was just a delegation of New York Times reporters, 5 of them. Nicholas Kristof headed
Oh,
the,
yeah.
and he came back and reported that every place he went, even at the end of a soccer game, they had a flash on the screen about people defending themselves with their nuclear weapon, and everybody cheered. It just gives them an excuse, a reason, actually maybe not an excuse, a reason to
right.
say we have to keep these because these guys are on the other end.
That's right. Yep.
With regard to the Iran deal, again, Trump was very isolated. His own, his own Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State and his
Right.
Chief of Staff, all of them kept telling him, no, don't do this. And, again, sometimes it just seems like Trump gets enraged about something and something that he doesn't understand.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
it's
Right.
amazing the ignorance of the President of the United States. I mean, this man doesn't know very much about the world or how the world operates. And so it's a constant struggle for those around him to try to educate him to some extent or to restrain him from doing something impulsive and stupid. And he seems to be prepared to do impulsive and stupid things. And it's a real battle. And so, that's why, and again, with the issue of nuclear weapons, the comment that was revealed this week that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson called Trump a moron.
Yeah.
And that got a lot of play. The context for that, if people don't know where that comment came from, is that Trump was presented with some charts that showed the number of nuclear weapons that are existing in the world. So the United States right now has about 6,800 warheads the Russian Federation around 7,000. And both are pledged to decommission
Right.
warheads, so to get both down to around a little over 4,000 by 2023. But of course, in the 60s and 70s, we had many, many more.
Oh, yeah.
So at one point, the world was awash with over 70,000 nuclear warheads. And of course, the United States used to have well over, 30,000
40.
more than we do now. Well, Trump saw that we had dropped off, that we used to have, that we used to have over
Yeah.
40,000 warheads, and we're down from that peak. And he just was enraged that why have we gotten rid of so many weapons, and why are we behind
Yeah.
The Soviet,
Russia?
yeah.
And this is when Tillerson just said, man, this guy is a moron.
Yeah.
He just
Right.
doesn't
He
understand
doesn't
the
get
most
it.
basic thing about nuclear weapons and the negotiation process.
And the 60-year history of this, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when you get the Secretary of State referring to the President of the United States as a moron with regard to his understanding of
Yeah.
nuclear weapons,
Wow.
can there be anything more
Scarier?
frightening,
No.
anything scarier than that?
Well,
And
yeah.
go ahead, Dan.
Well, the other thing that he's doing all these things, like he did with healthcare and all these, strongly to undercut anything that President Obama did. I really think
Yes,
that's part of the motivation.
I
If
do as well.
Obama did this, I'm going to cut it out. I'm going to erase him from the history books.
That's right.
And he's very clear about that. And to make decisions on that basis rather than weighing the other things involved is just so
Yeah.
dangerous and so destructive. Wow.
Yeah. Which is interesting. It's ironic because that creates its own backlash.
Yeah.
Just like America First does and just like taunting North Korea does. The more you try to erase someone, guess what? The more they're going to get written about in the actual history books because everyone sees through that, right? Or most folks can see
Right,
through
right,
that. But
yeah.
but it is incredibly dangerous and it's this knee-jerk reaction, right? Nuclear weapons, good. Iran must be bad.
Yeah.
Like it seems to be that's the
Wow.
only compass that directs behavior. It doesn't matter what we might actually have done or known.
And he made that very strange comment back during the campaign. Well, why do we have all these nuclear weapons if we can't use them? And again, that's just the most astounding
It is.
comment.
Right.
I mean,
Wow.
what part of
Right.
the destruction that nuclear weapons cause don't you understand?
Exactly.
I mean, any use of the weapons would just be horrific, and the possibility of killing millions of people on the one hand, and then creating enough dust and debris to lead us toward a nuclear winter, which would then kill millions more. So even a limited use of nuclear weapons in a specific theater has those potentials to, have the most devastating consequences,
Right.
not only for that particular region, but for the entire world. And to talk casually about, well, why aren't we using nuclear weapons, or that I'm going to totally destroy North Korea. I mean, he actually said that
Yeah.
at the United Nations. The President of the United States is up on the dais and says,
Yeah.
threatens to totally destroy North Korea.
12 million people.
Now that's, on the one hand, that's genocide.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, this
it is
is
genocide.
one of the, that's threatening to commit the most heinous international crime imaginable, genocide,
Yeah.
crimes against humanity. And here's the President of the United States threatening to commit these heinous international crimes at the United Nations, which is an organization that was created
That's right.
to keep the peace after World War II and is dedicated to saying no war, never again.
Right.
We're a long way from 1945.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure that everybody really remembers
Yep.
the terrible, destructive thing that was.
That's right.
But then to realize that those weapons were just miniatures compared to what we got
right.
today. And all the destruction that was done with that, the people that were just wiped out, what would one of these things do? Much less so many of them that we have.
That's right.
The consequences for the world,
That's right.
incredible.
So it's not just Trump's lack of understanding of geopolitics, it's basic logic, right?
Yeah.
To go all the way back to the classics, the art of war, to destroy my enemy is to destroy myself. And I know of no better situation that this is ultimately clear in,
Right.
than nuclear
Right.
weapons, right? Yeah.
Right. Wow.
It is sort of amazing. And again, we seem to be dependent right now on the group of people around Trump in the White House to kind of to control him. And I mean, and the feud that the president had with Senator Bob Corker
Right.
from Tennessee, who has announced that he's not going to run for re-election, and he made some comments about the fact that Mattis and Tillerson and Kelly seem to be the only thing keeping us from chaos right now. Well, then of course Trump gets furious and starts tweeting attacks on Corker, and then Corker comes back with that comment about the adult daycare center at the White House. I mean, that the imagery of that.
Morons and daycare.
Wow.
So Donald Trump is being portrayed by his own people, Republicans, conservative Republicans, as on the one hand a moron who doesn't understand the most basic thing about nuclear weapons, or as a man-child who is throwing tantrums in the White House like a toddler who has to be controlled by the adults in the room, or he'll likely to do destructive things.
I know.
Wow.
I mean, that's not people on the left
No.
making those.
No.
I mean, people on the left obviously have their own criticisms to make. These are conservative Republicans
Correct.
who are characterizing Donald Trump in
Still
this
some
manner.
pretty safe folks, though. People who aren't running for re-election or
Yeah.
are so safe that, and we haven't seen some major disavowing
Yeah.
of Trump by the majority of the Republican Party still. So that's a problem.
When's that going to happen?
Yeah,
What-
Well-
Denise, what can
I don't know what the logic is there. I think it's better to have a fool that you can probably try to do some things and get some things by than it is to have an opposition, and I think that's where their logic still rests. Yeah. And they don't still know how much that base, Trump's base, will hurt them in the midterms.
Yeah, that's what they're looking at.
That's what they're looking
the
at.
2018.
And these kinds of knee-jerk things still appeal to a large base,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The knee-jerk nuclear weapons are good and Iran is bad and Obama is even worse. That appeals to a large segment still, and I think the Republicans are very worried about that and still very shy.
So where does
Say
the common
anything.
good come into all this? That's off the table. That doesn't count at all. It's all about power
That's
and
right.
me keeping elected, and the destruction that happens to the country, the destruction that happens to the world. We don't deal with that.
Right.
We deal with getting reelected.
Exactly.
With regard to nuclear weapons and American foreign policy and the Pentagon budget, I'm reminded of there's a term that we use in the social sciences, the normalization of
Yeah.
deviance.
Exactly.
My good friend and colleague Diane Vaughn used that term extensively to talk about the organizational culture at NASA, which led to the Challenger disaster. There has been a normalization, a kind of acceptance of certain deviant practices within the organization that were leading them down a path toward disaster. No one within the organization was able to kind of recognize that because the changes had occurred gradually, evolved over time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so people from the outside could look in and see what are you people
Right.
doing? But within the organizational culture, they were kind of blinded to what was happening. And I think you can take that concept and apply it more broadly to political cultures. And in fact, Robert J. Lifton and Richard Falk back in the early 1980s, writing about nuclear weapons, talked about nuclearism, right? The reliance on nuclear weapons as an instrument of foreign policy. But I think there was also a sense of they were talking about the sort of normalization. And Lifton, in his new book, which we'll talk about maybe on another show, The Climate Swerve, but he talks about normalization, but he uses the term malignant normalization, which I think really gets at, our situation with our reliance on nuclear
Yes.
weapons.
Yes.
The fact that we've normalized them to some
Yes.
extent, or that at least Trump seems to be caught up in a normalization of
Right.
these weapons. Why don't we use these
Right,
weapons?
yeah.
But it's a very malignant normalization.
Yes,
Right.
And
absolutely.
of course, ever since we used those weapons against Japan, we have attempted to normalize them.
Yeah.
Right.
And justify the decision to commit that crime, which it was a crime against
Right.
international law, to drop those weapons on innocent civilians. but we've tried to justify that crime ever since and justify our continuing reliance on them.
Yes.
So we've had this normalization, and now it's a very malignant normalization.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that gets carried over into the Pentagon budget, right?
Yes.
I mean, in what sane world, in what rational world do you spend $1 trillion a year on building weapons that you hope that you will never need to use?
That's right.
When, again, your society has so many serious social problems and so many
Gee.
serious
That's
needs.
right.
I mean, it's just, to me, it's the height of insanity that the United States Congress just passed a National Defense
right.
Authorization Act. It's not the actual appropriation act,
Correct.
but it's the Authorization Act.
Yes.
And they are basically budgeting $700 billion for the Pentagon. $700 billion, $640 billion for discretionary defense spending, another $60 billion for overseas military operations, can you say Afghanistan and Iraq,
Exactly.
Right.
And that's not the full story.
No.
Because
Buried
there's
in
other
other.
spending in the
That's right.
federal budget on nuclear weapons, for
Energy,
example, and Department of
education,
Energy.
all those departments.
So when you add all of that together, we end up with well over $1 trillion. And we know that this spending eats up well over half of our discretionary spending in the federal budget. And this is money that is, for the most part, completely unnecessary for any legitimate defense needs.
Yes.
And it's money that there is enormous waste, fraud, and abuse. What we're doing here, of course, is we're subsidizing defense contractors and the exorbitant salaries of the executives of defense contractors. And we're creating weapons that we don't need and we should never use, and it's just enormously wasteful and abusive, and yet we do it and nobody seems to think twice about
Right.
it. And
Right.
if we didn't do it, people would be, senators and Congress people would be attacked for not supporting the country for being against the defense of the United States.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I just keep thinking about the recent series on PBS on Vietnam. And when you watch that and you see a couple of things, what a terrible waste that was, how
That's right.
destructive that was of human life, and at the same time, the deception, the lies that were told to the American people
Yes.
to get them to accept this.
That's right.
The same thing happens here, but it happens in a different way. It's not the killing, the immediate killing. It's not the draft, but it is taking those resources that we need for healthcare, for education, instead of that, we're putting it into here.
That's
and
right.
so there's not the outcry. There's not the people on the streets that there were during that war. And that,
Exactly.
but now you're starting to see some people. Basevich has been more active lately, writing about the futility of the terrible waste that we're spending on the Pentagon.
That's right. Well, you know, from my perspective, there are always sort of two fundamental questions, because budgets mean priorities.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, here
Yeah.
we're setting a clear priority allocation of values, right? That's one of the roles of government. Priorities are pretty clear. But the question is, what really keeps us safe?
Oh,
Right? And if we were to really look at that question, there's a lot of really good work on what actually keeps us
Exactly.
safe. Guess what it is?
Exactly.
Education, taking care of your environment, getting rid of nuclear weapons, all the other things that we are not funding, that we are defunding in order to feel protected are the exact opposite of the things that actually do keep us safe and keep us
Yes.
in our livelihoods and have a way to have a future. And that to me is just the most demoralizing thing about this. And I often think there's some political science critiques that sort of say in international relations that why we keep doing this now is because that's all America has left.
wow.
So we used to have a moral spirit,
Yeah.
our democracy and our
Right.
values and economic, that's dwindled. There's Germany, there's China, right? We used to be a leader in technology, right? The one superpower we have left is to be able to say that we can destroy you. And so it's sort of like, as a woman on the show, the guy that has to buy the Corvette, right?
Yeah.
It sort of reminds me of that. If this is all we have left, then you really have to make a big showing. And that shows, again, our priorities and I think undermines the real things that anybody who takes a deeper contextual look actually do keep us safe.
So when you think about what we spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, what, $4 trillion? We will eventually have spent
Eventually,
$4 trillion.
yeah, yeah.
If we had spent a portion of that in trying to help those countries
Exactly.
develop economically,
Educating women, giving,
Yeah.
planting trees, come on.
healthcare, infrastructure, loaning them the technology that they need to, we would.
Then we might be friends too. If
We certainly would be safer. We certainly would be
That's the
safer.
argument, right? But
Yeah.
that takes a lot more work, and it takes us, negotiating and really thinking deeply and long term about things. And we seem to be unwilling to do that
Right.
more than ever in America. And this budget is just another clear sign that that's not our priority, to work with others and to elevate all beings. That's not our priority at all.
I saw a chart this week that really struck me about, everybody's seen that chart, how from the late 1970s on, after the Second World War up to 1970, as productivity goes up, people's salaries go
That's
up.
right.
And then in the late 70s, it changes, and productivity still goes up,
That's right.
but salaries are the same.
That's right.
And more people have trouble making it. So at the same time, we cut what we're spending on support
That's right.
for people there, dramatically escalate how much we're spending on prisons.
That's right.
So that the population in prisons goes from about 300,000, something like that, up to over 2 million.
right.
It seems to me that it's the same parallel.
It is.
That instead of putting the money into human development,
Right.
we put the money into destruction, because
Right.
this is destruction
We
of
don't
these
wanna-
people's lives.
That's right. We don't want to deal with the causes.
Right, that's right.
Right?
We don't
And
wanna
then-
get it
Because
down
that's
that
just
close.
your individual fault, right?
right.
And so we'll spend plenty of money on the consequences,
Yeah.
though, right? The
Ron-
hurricanes, prisons, military, all fall into that same category.
Exactly,
from
and I
the
remember what
benefit.
you always said, that social supports reduce crime, lack of
That's
social
right.
supports increase crime. And
Right.
so that's what we have,
That's right.
and that's where we go.
So you can make a sober, rational argument for thinking about the priorities in terms of allocating our scarce tax resources
That's right.
and using it to benefit the majority of the people in our country,
Right.
including most of the people who ended up voting for Donald Trump, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
many of them are economically hurting. We could certainly do so much more to assist them with a different set of priorities for spending at the national level. But we have this normalization of
Yes.
the military and the militarism. I would say it's militarism because
Right.
it's an extreme, exaggerated emphasis on the military. Again, above and beyond any legitimate defense needs that the country has. And so then we need to ask, I think, a sort of a sociological question of why does this happen? How does there develop this kind of social and cultural support for an extremely destructive and irrational process of allocating money and operating?
Yeah.
And so, that's one of the questions that I always want to ask. I mean, what, Sid Lenz put it very well, is that, empires are always based on the myth of morality.
That's right.
Yeah.
There always has to be some
Yeah.
kind of myth or symbolic meaning that's attached to this. And so again, we get back to the notion of American exceptionalism, and a lot of it, I think, goes back to World War II.
Yeah.
World War II was the good war. Studs Terkel's
Right.
title,
Right.
Studs
Yeah.
put that in quotation marks, of course. It was the good war in the sense that there was a clear enemy and an obvious need to respond to Hitler and fascism and the attack on Pearl Harbor, and we could most clearly be the good guys, right?
Yeah.
Fighting the good war and doing the right thing. And I think that, there are lots of myths that came out of World War II, but that's that model, and then I think we've retained that ever
Right.
since, to view the use of American military power. But our actual use of military power from World War II on in no way responds to that situation.
No.
That's right.
We
No,
become
that's
an
right.
empire focusing on imperial domination and engaging in all kinds of interventions and illegal wars and overthrowing democratically elected governments. And yet that just sort of gets hidden from, behind the broader symbolic, we're the United States, we're the good guys, we won
Yeah.
World War II,
City
we only
seated on a
fight
hill.
for good causes. And so most people buy into that. And
Right.
of course you try to reinforce that culturally and symbolically in whatever way that you can, through the flag, talking about supporting the
right.
troops, standing at attention during the national anthem.
Exactly,
Right.
nailing it.
And so, so again, if we talk about what's been happening with regard to the NFL protests, part of it, I think, to understand that is that, okay, Colin Kaepernick and the African American players began to sit, or then, of course, take the knee to protest racism.
Yes.
To protest police violence against African Americans. That was their stated
Right.
intent, and they wanted to find a way to symbolically express their concern over this important issue. But of course, it's so easy then for Trump and Pence and others to come in and flip that back toward the militarism and the symbolic. They're
Yeah.
disrespecting the flag. They're not being patriotic. They're not respecting the sacrifice of our troops. And that plays very well, doesn't it?
And they have so merged militarism with sports. I mean, I guess the Pentagon pays the NFL millions of dollars a year to make sure that they play the national anthem, that they have the troops march in, and everybody's all psyched about the game and their teams,
Right.
and now we're cheering for all these guys, and that contributes to the normalization. That fits with the sports, that fits with everything else. And these guys are saying, you know what? No, we're not standing for that. Because once this nation, it's just what King said, all we ask of America is that you live up to what you say on paper. Once you start living up to that, we'll stand for the thing. But we're not living up to it. And I so admire these guys.
Yeah.
Kaepernick especially, because he's really taken a hit for that. And he's used his resources to help so many courses. He gave $100,000 to people working on DACA. And I just admire that he was willing to take that stand and take the consequence.
Absolutely. I mean, this kind of political advocacy is what's essential to our democracy.
Yeah.
And it is free speech.
Right.
Is absolutely one of the best and clearest examples of the expression of free speech. And there's often a big debate about, well, some speech is offensive or hate speech. And in America, you do get to say anything. There's no exception for hate speech. You can be as offensive as you want to be. We happen to be on the moral side of Kaepernick.
Right.
Totally agreed. But the answer for speech when it offends you is not to silence it or try to quell it. It's more speech
And
for us to speak up and for the other side, whatever arguments it might have, to say them and for those to be brought out in public discourse and then abandoned because there's nothing behind them except for you ought to because I said so because we got this symbol.
And they're so respectful.
Goodness.
I mean, they're
They are
kneeling.
very
They're
respectful about
not
it.
burning a flag. They're not throwing
Which
things
is
at the
entirely
flag.
legal as well.
Yeah.
That's right.
I think a lot of people don't know the story, but when Kaepernick first came up with this protest, he sat. He
Yes.
sat,
Yes.
and
Yes.
but then he was contacted by a veteran who was offended and said, I don't like what you're doing, I'm offended, and so they ended up, well, let's talk. And so they actually got together and had a conversation, and Kaepernick tried to explain why he was doing what he was doing, and the vet tried to explain to him why he found it offensive. And I guess they had a very productive dialogue, and it was the vet who suggested to Kaepernick, well, why don't you
Wow.
take a knee?
Wow.
That would still-
We kneel.
How about
we
that?
kneel
I didn't know
for
that.
I didn't hear that
to
either.
respect.
That's great.
We kneel to propose. We kneel
Yeah.
to pray. Kneeling is a way to express certain kinds of respect, and so I think your protest would be more effective if you took a knee rather than to sit. So it was actually an American military veteran in conversation with Colin Kaepernick who suggested that taking the knee would be the better way to engage in his
Very
protest.
interesting.
And again, it's just one of the things I think that can happen. Obviously, here were two people who had a disagreement, who didn't see eye to eye, but by
Right.
sitting down together and talking and learning each other's perspective. Well, why are you doing this? What you're doing is offensive to me. Why are you doing it? Oh, now I understand. But do you understand why I found it to be offensive?
right.
And you can go,
Wow.
there can
Very
be
It's
cool.
called democracy. It's supposed to happen at this larger level. We seem to be incapable of
Yeah.
recognizing that someone could hold a different position than yourself.
And you
And
could have-
going straight to that means you're unpatriotic and you
Yeah.
don't support the good guys and right,
Right.
and
Yeah.
support the troops and love it or leave it.
But there
Right.
could be some kind of
Oh.
productive dialogue that
That's-
grows out of that.
That's
Yes.
exactly right.
And of course, it's the attempt by Trump and Pence to, it's misdirection, right?
Yeah.
It's a way to
misdirection.
say,
Absolutely.
okay, you black athletes, we don't, we're not going to recognize the real issue here, the real cause, because we don't want to address that.
That's right.
And we just want to use you as a political football,
That's right.
Right.
as a device to basically throw red meat to our base.
That's exactly
and to
right.
further demonize you. And so if we flip, we don't recognize, we don't accept the reasons you're offering for your actions. Instead, we're going to offer a completely different
That's right.
and false narrative about what you're doing, that
That
you're not
sells.
respecting the flag, that you're disrespecting the troops. And of course, that's not their intent at
No.
all.
No.
It is about racism.
That's right.
Absolutely.
And Trump and Pence don't want to talk about racism.
Not at
They don't want
all.
to acknowledge it, and they don't want to talk about it. And so they have to somehow demonize these athletes and flip the script and try to say that it's about something else
That's
that
right,
it's not
yeah.
about at all.
Right.
Right.
And again, to say nothing about the First Amendment rights of people to have the President
right.
of the United States, the government
Well-
coming out and saying, if you engage in this
Yes.
this speech, I'm arguing that you should be punished, and so
Yes.
Right.
get those son of a
So-
guns off the field, or that
I
the
kinda-
owner should fire them. And this is the government now basically threatening punishment for people exercising speech.
Right. So now that's not okay, according to our Constitution,
No,
right? So
no.
I really hope that that some folks might try to take Trump to court over this, just like they did the
be
travel
great,
ban.
yeah.
Because this is the exact thing that the First Amendment and freedom of expression is supposed to protect, that a political leader would try to silence some type of speech. And his statements are right on the edge of Supreme Court precedent. I mean, using his Twitter account to say they should be fired,
Right.
to say that you should boycott, that's political speech if I've ever heard
Absolutely.
it, inciting a behavior to punish a particular
Yeah,
class of American,
yeah.
which is how the First Amendment cases are always decided.
Mm-hmm.
It would be borderline, but it would be very interesting to hear those
Yeah.
arguments, I think. One kind of fun thing I looked up, because, I love Pew and the polls, and I thought, well, because really free speech should be about tolerance, should be about this example I didn't even know about these, the original protester and the original offended person, right, working it out. So there is this tolerance idea, and Americans are much more supportive of being able to say anything that offends anybody else, right? 77% of Americans say, you should be able to say whatever you want, even if it deeply offends me. Now, then they followed up with Pew and said, well, how do you think people are too easily offended today, right? When you break that down between Trump voters, say 83% of Trump voters would say everybody else is too easily offended. And here they are, being pretty easily offended, I would argue, right? The logic of this is starting to it's always the other guy. and
Right,
that's-
exactly.
That seems to be the base that is really getting played to. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas, for example, I spent some time in Germany. There are laws in Germany against Holocaust denial, for example, right? You can't go out and say that didn't happen.
Right.
There's lots of different things you can't say, even though here we would allow, of course, we have allowed many of those same kind of statements to be made, right? We go ahead and say tolerance, but that means you don't get to get so offended, maybe. I think that was a good poll that Pew
Very,
followed up on.
very
though.
good
Yeah.
point. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing, just about the protest, I mean, so the attention should be directed toward the issue of racism.
Yes.
and-
That's right.
And
Mhm.
police
Yes.
violence against young African American males. And so here we run into the resistance of many Americans to think about or understand the notion of institutionalized racism or
Yes.
systemic racism, racism that gets built into social structures.
Yeah.
You know, in a sense, you can have, as one sociologist put it, racism without racist, right?
That's right.
Because once it's built into the culture and the social structure, it can continue without any obvious overt
Right.
racism, although we know there's still plenty of racists out there, unfortunately.
Right.
But it's that lack of understanding of the institutionalized nature of the racism and the discrimination, and also just the ignorance of history, the inability to put things in a broader historical context. So did you hear what Mike Ditka said the other day?
No, no.
So Mike Ditka says, there hasn't been any oppression of African Americans for 100 years.
Oh, my
Wow.
Lord. Wow.
I mean, so here's a respected figure in
Yeah.
professional football,
Yeah.
Wow. Gee.
Super Bowl winning coach, Iron Mike, and to be able to, and here's a man who's worked with African Americans
Yeah.
and probably is colorblind when it comes to making
To
decisions
talent and the
on the
game.
field about
Yeah.
who should play and
But
who's going to help me
systemic.
win. I don't see black and white, I see good players or bad players. And yet to then step back and make such an astoundingly ignorant statement, no oppression of blacks for 100 years. I mean, Mike Ditka is old enough to have known
sure.
about
Oh,
Selma.
my goodness gracious.
And lunch cutter sit-ins and, you know, Rosa Parks and, I
Or
mean,
just more of these players he's had over the year. He never got to know any of them enough to realize their story was a little bit different
Wow.
than his or some of the
Gee.
other players,
Yeah.
right?
but I think
Wow.
it does express a larger issue that people don't want to deal with the issue of racism and don't see it as institutionalized and think that somehow we have moved past this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And again, it's just that lack of being able to understand things in a broader historical context and to understand. I mean, I guess this is the fault of sociologists that we don't talk about the importance of historical
Yeah.
social structures. And you can't really understand this issue without
Right.
really understanding something
That's
about
right.
the historical development of
Yeah.
social structures and institutions and cultures regarding race and discrimination.
And you think about how insightful Dr. King was when on April the 4th, 1967, he gave a speech against the war in Vietnam, and he linked racism, materialism, and militarism as the great evils. And what was the reaction to his talk? He was pilloried in the papers, even by black leaders in the
Right.
country. But he was right on target. Those things are all come together. They're all linked.
Yep.
And just what we were talking about here. And he took the courageous step of calling attention to the links
Yeah.
among all those things. And I think he was just, we owe him such a debt of gratitude. for that.
Absolutely. This is another one of these myths that we like to believe, isn't it? That we were over this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And
That's
then,
in the
we
past.
normalize it.
that's right.
Yeah.
to
Right?
normalize.
It's the same, I think, theory that you were just describing to us.
Yeah.
We would really, really like to believe that was just over.
Yeah.
So can't we just, say we did that?
Right, right. We've
'Cause
done enough.
Because otherwise
Yeah.
it's uncomfortable, right? And we have a real problem being uncomfortable.
Oh,
Yeah, and race makes us very uncomfortable.
Exactly.
We just can't seem to have a productive conversation
Yeah.
about race.
Yeah.
Everybody gets so defensive. Whites get so defensive so quickly when the
Yep.
issue comes up, and
Yeah.
so and there's a history, of course, of athletes, black
Yes.
athletes
Yes.
standing out and making a statement. I mean, one has to only go back to Muhammad Ali and refusing to be inducted
Right.
into the army, and thinking about John Carlos and Tommy Smith in
Yep.
1968 at the
Yeah.
the
Olympics.
after they won gold and bronze at the 200 meters, standing on the platform with their black fist salute. And there's also another interesting story there about Peter Norman, the Australian, who won the silver medal, who very definitely supported them. And the story about Norman supporting them and the friendship that they developed, that's kind of a nice, interesting story
Wow.
also. That
How
I
about
learned
that?
so much from
People
Ron
should-
Kramer.
people should look
I'm
into.
always writing books on people I'm going to have to go look up now. Thank you.
Peter Norman,
The
he's now,
social
Peter Norman.
education.
he's now
Okay.
deceased, but he was a Australian
I'm not familiar.
runner
I
who
didn't
won the
realize
silver
that.
medal in that race and strongly supported his two friends as they made their
Wow,
protest.
that's great. That's great.
So there's a history of this. Jackie Robinson.
That's
Yes.
right.
Jackie Robinson, in his autobiography, said, "I can't stand for the national anthem.
That's right.
I never had it made. I was disrespected in this country. I can't, I can't stand up and support the
Wow.
flag, given how my people have been treated."
Yeah.
And so there's a long history of black athletes because they are so prominent in American consciousness,
Yes.
right? How many African Americans come to American prominence in white American consciousness other than athletes, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I think the athletes black athletes do feel a special obligation
Yeah.
to speak out. Some do.
That's right.
And Robinson did.
And Kaepernick, like you said, I have so much respect. What a great way to be able to use your role
Yeah.
and
Right.
showcase
Right.
this issue.
Yeah. And he said, look, I'm doing great. I'm so fortunate.
That's right.
But so many other people out there,
Are
and it's
not.
just not fair for me to ignore
right.
what's happening with them and just go on with my own life.
That's right. And he's paid costs,
Pay a lot of
I
costs.
mean, while it's tempting for me to think about legal action against Trump on this, which I think you could make a good argument, it would at least get into court.
Yeah.
What's actually being discussed is legal action against the players for signing
Right.
contracts that
Right,
said,
right.
and the language is very thorny on these contracts. You are expected to, but it doesn't say you have to stand for this anthem, even though the coaches take all this money from the Pentagon to do that. And the labor union lawyers are already coming out and saying, we'll represent every single one of you because this
That's
is free
great.
speech, and anything you do in solidarity, the locking arms that affects your job is covered under the labor laws. And so there's a ton of folks coming out now and saying,
Wow,
we'll
that's
represent every
great.
single one of you if they try to fire you or
I
sue
hope
you.
it
And
goes
so
to court
I
because
do too. I would love to see this.
Trump is pushing the NFL and what's his
right.
name, the chair, the commissioner of the NFL.
yeah.
He
Roger Goodell.
right. He said to the owners, right, that everybody's expected to stand for that. So it's sort of coming to a head here.
Right.
Yeah. All right, well, we've reached our last minute, so I want to thank Denise Keel and Don Cooney. We've had another wonderful discussion today of some very important critical issues. I hope we've provided some alternative perspectives for people to think about with regard to those issues. That's what we take on as our role here, so thank you for being with us on Critical Issues, Alternative Views, and we hope you come back again.